Now you are looking at the youngest girl serial killer in history who took the lives of other children with her own hands. Sit back and let's get started. The girl in the photo is Mary Flora Bell. She was born on May 26, 1957, in the town of Newcastle in the northeast of England and became the second child in a dysfunctional family, to put it mildly. Shortly before Mary was born, her mother, Betty Bell, was only 17 years old, and she was clearly not happy about becoming a mother again. According to her sister, immediately after Mary was born, Betty began screaming and swearing at hospital staff. She just didn't want them to put the small child in her arms. She looked at her daughter with disgust, and then she said, "Take this thing away from me." This bad mother spent most of her time not with her children, but on the street where she worked. Betty was a fairly well-known prostitute in Newcastle and even beyond. Often, she did not appear at home for weeks at a time. Then her stepfather, William Billy Bell, about whom little is known, except that when choosing between tea and coffee, he always chose whiskey, sat with Mary and her older sister Catherine. In addition, from time to time he was involved in armed robberies, for which, in the end, he was sent to jail. It is known that this man was the stepfather of Mary and her older sister, as all official sources also state that the identity of the biological father is unknown. But, despite the fact that Betty married Billy Bell after Mary was born, it is possible that he could be her biological father. This is not known exactly, but what is much more important is that the man, in principle, was not involved in raising children, and if he was an example to follow, he was an exceptionally bad one. Mary's childhood can hardly be called happy. The girl repeatedly received domestic injuries and, interestingly, only when she was close to her mother. One day her mother dropped her from a first-floor window, and another time she drugged her daughter with sleeping pills, by accident, at least that's what Betty Bell herself said. She denied any charges of intentional harm to a child, but you will agree that it is difficult to call it an accident that she once sold her daughter to a mentally unstable woman who could not have her own children and was looking for alternative options. Then Mary's older sister, Catherine, found the woman's house and was able to persuade her to give the child back. Betty Bell's relatives repeatedly offered her to take both children from her and even officially adopt her, but Betty refused. Most likely this is due to her relationships with other family members, because giving or even selling Mary to someone other than her relatives, as you already understood, she didn't mind. Subsequently, when Mary was 5 years old, Betty began to engage her for the needs of her clients. Yes, you heard it right. Betty can be named Mother of the Year according to Hell. Mary Bell grew up as a withdrawn and aggressive child, with a not very stable psyche. The girl's mood constantly changed, and for many years she suffered from enuresis. Urinary incontinence is typical for children who are constantly under stress. At Mary's school, there were practically no children who wanted to spend time in her company, but there were many others with whom she fought. In fact, her only friend was 13-year-old Norma Bell, who lived in the next house. Despite the same last name, they were not related. Mary first crossed the line 2 weeks before the first murder. It's important to add something here for context. In the 1960s, Newcastle was undergoing urban renewal, which involved demolishing old buildings in many areas of the city to make way for modern houses. However, all these demolitions did not occur in one day, but dragged on for years. During this period, local children often played in or near these abandoned houses. One of the most popular such places in Newcastle was a vacant lot near the railway line, parallel to which St. Margaret's Road ran. So, on May 11, 1968, Mary, along with Norma Bell, took a 3-year-old neighbor boy to the roof of an abandoned bomb shelter to supposedly play there together. But if this was a game, it was clearly not the one the boy wanted to play. Mary pushed him over 7 feet to the ground. Seeing that he was not moving, the girls got scared and immediately disappeared. But fortunately, the boy survived, received severe lacerations to his head, but survived. He was soon discovered on St. Margaret's Road. Bloodied and in a state of shock, he told his parents that he had been thrown from the bomb shelter by Mary and Norma Bell, but he did not remember which of them did it. That same day, the parents of 3 children contacted the police, accusing Mary and Norma of trying to strangle their children. The police spoke with the girls and their parents. Mary completely denied any attempts to strangle anyone or in any other way physically harm anyone, but Norma immediately told everything, stating the following.
Mary approached one girl and asked what would happen if someone was strangled. Would he die? Then she put her hands on her throat and squeezed. The girl started to blush. I told Mary to stop, but she didn't want to. Then she grabbed Pauline's throat and also began to blush. Another girl came up, Sue Cornish, and Mary did the same to her.
The police reported these cases to local authorities. However, due to the age of the girls, no action was taken other than a serious reprimanding conversation with each of the girls. On May 25th of that year, Mary Bell lured a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown into an abandoned building on St. Margaret's Road and strangled him with her own hands. Afterward, she ran away, leaving his body lying right on the dirty floor. That same day, at approximately 4:30 p.m., 3 children accidentally stumbled upon Martin's lifeless body. There was foam around his mouth and traces of blood on his clothes. The children ran outside and called the first adult they saw for help. It turned out to be John Goal, a local worker. He immediately began performing CPR in hopes of saving the boy. At that moment, 2 inseparable friends, Mary and Norma Bell, entered the room. Goal shouted for them to get away and continued trying to resuscitate Martin. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed because the boy was already dead. Leaving the building, City Hall, and Norma went to the house where Martin lived and told his aunt the following.
One of your sister's children has just had an accident. We think it's Martin, but we can't say for sure because he's covered in blood.
After which they took the unfortunate woman to that very building. Investigators found a half-empty bottle of aspirin near the body of the murdered boy, which is why they initially assumed that he died as a result of poisoning or an overdose of the drug. However, the very next day, an autopsy showed that this was not the case. The famous British forensic expert Bernard Henry Knight did not find any traces of violence on the child's body and could not determine the cause of death. However, he noted that theoretically, another child could strangle the victim without leaving any traces due to the slight physical exertion. In this case, an open verdict was passed, that is, the death was suspicious, but the investigation did not have any satisfactory leads. No one in Newcastle believed that another child could be a killer. Then, on May 26th, on her 11th birthday, Mary brutally beat Norma Bell's younger brother. She had to be pulled away from the child. Only his father succeeded, who simply threw Mary out of the house. Later that same day, he and Norma snuck into the kindergarten, where they created a real pogrom, painted the walls, tore up a bunch of books, and overturned tables and chairs. But the most interesting thing was left behind by several notes in which it was written,
We did murder Martin Brown you bastard I murder, so that I may come back off we murder. Watch out Fanny and faggot.
All these notes soon fell into the hands of the police. If they had taken them a little more seriously, they most likely would have saved the life of another child, but the police did not take any of this seriously. They simply wrote it off as children's tricks. For the next few days, Mary continued to come to the Browns' house. She constantly pestered his relatives with questions like, "How do you feel now? Are you missing Martin?" On May 29th, when the family was preparing for the funeral, Mary and Norma Bell once again came to his house. Upon seeing the boy's mother, Mary said that she wanted to see him. When the woman replied that, unfortunately, her son had died, Mary replied as follows, "Oh, I know he is dead. I want to see him in the coffin." Later, during an art assignment at school, Mary drew a picture of a dead child with the caption, "Pills." The teacher was not as embarrassed by this, as at that moment all the children at school were only talking about this murder. But, as we know, Mary left on paper more than a manifestation of her imagination. After Martin's funeral, local residents organized a demonstration at which they called on the authorities to quickly demolish all the abandoned buildings. In the photo that you see now on the screen, two girls are holding banners calling on them to do this. That girl on the right is Mary Flora Bell. During this period, she became increasingly tough. Once, she even beat up her only friend Norma, shouting, "I'm a murderer!" And very soon she confirmed that these were not just words. On July 31st, 1968, Mary Bell and Norma were playing with a 3-year-old boy named Brian Gall outside the house where he lived. It was then, from the kitchen window, that the boy's parents saw him alive for the last time. The girls persuaded Brian to play with them in a more interesting place, namely in a vacant lot near the railroad, not far from the house where Mary killed Martin Brown. There, right on the street, Mary grabbed the boy and pinched his nose with one hand and squeezed his throat with the other. Norma watched everything from the sidelines and did nothing. When Brian stopped breathing, both girls simply ran away. However, less than an hour later they returned with scissors. With scissors, Mary cut out the letter N on the boy's stomach, then changed it to M. These were the initials of his girlfriends. She also cut off his hair, cut his legs, and severely mutilated his genitals. Brian's body was placed between concrete slabs in a vacant lot, covered with a small layer of grass and weeds, and the scissors were hidden nearby, after which they went home. The search for Brian began a couple of hours after his disappearance. All their relatives and neighbors joined them. The body was found that evening at 8:30 p.m. Police arriving at the crime scene noticed bluish discoloration of the victim's lips and several bruises on the victim's neck. This time, investigators no longer ruled out the possibility that the killer was a child. All wounds were inflicted very lightly without the use of much force. Nobody wanted the killer to remain free. All police forces were devoted to this matter. More than 100 detectives were involved in the investigation, thanks to which by August 2nd it was possible to interview 1,200 children. Only those children who lived in the area where the boys' bodies were found were interviewed. Among all respondents, only 2 children differed in their behavior. You can guess the first time what their names are. Mary and Norma Bell were seen with Brian on the day of his death, so they were questioned especially carefully. Norma could not hide her delight at what was happening to her and constantly smiled. She clearly enjoyed being part of the investigation. However, she answered all the investigators' questions evasively like, "I don't know anything, I haven't seen anything." Mary was even more closed and suspicious. The testimony of both friends was clearly ill-conceived and contradictory. Both girls confirmed that they did see Brian on the day of his death, only before lunch, and they don't know what happened after noon since they went home. The investigators felt that something was wrong, and very gently and without threats continued to interview Mary and Norma. The next day, Mary said a little more, as if she remembered seeing an 8-year-old boy playing with Brian. Moreover, when she and Norma were already walking home, they saw how another boy hit Brian, and later that day, she saw even more how this boy with broken scissors tried to cut off the cat's tail. Besides, this boy was covered in grass and some weeds. Next quote.
I saw how he tried to cut off the cat's tail with scissors, but there was something wrong with them. Part of the scissors was either broken or bent.
After this statement, the man leading the case, James Dobson, realized that Mary Bell was definitely involved in the murder of Brian Gall because no one could know about the scissors except the police and the killer. Additionally, the boy whom Mary allegedly saw with Brian was at the local airport that day, confirmed by many witnesses. However, the investigator had no direct evidence that Mary was Brian's killer. On August 4th, everything began to take shape on its own. That day, Norma Bell decided to confess exactly what her friend Mary had done and told her parents everything. The parents, in turn, invited the investigator to their home, stating that their daughter wanted to make a statement about the death of Brian Gall. Dobson immediately arrived at the Bells' house and carefully questioned Norma, asking her to calmly tell everything she knew. The girl said she was present in the vacant lot when Mary strangled Brian with her own hands. Moreover, she added that Mary shared with her that she really enjoyed the murder process. At the crime scene, Norma showed exactly where the body lay and where the scissors, with which Mary mutilated it, were thrown. No one could know this for sure except the investigators, perpetrators of the crime, or witnesses. The next day, August 5th, James Dobson arrived at Mary Bell's house and once again questioned her about the events of July 31st. This time, the girl was very worried, constantly confused in her testimony, and finally said,
"You are trying to brainwash me. I will hire a lawyer to get me out of this."
The investigation lasted until August 7, 1968. More than 2,100 people came to say goodbye to little Brian Gall. Among them was the main investigator on his case, Mr. Dobson. 11-year-old Mary Bell also attended the funeral. Dobson kept his eyes on Mary, who stood in the front row of the Gall house as the coffin containing the little boy was carried out. The man went cold with horror. This is what he saw. Mary stood and laughed and rubbed her hands. The investigator thought,
"Oh my God, I have to arrest her or she will commit another crime."
That same evening, Norma and Mary Bell were charged with the murder of Brian Gall. Hearing this, Mary said,
"It suits me."
She also confirmed that she was indeed present when the boy was killed. But it was Norma who committed the murder, not her. In addition, Mary admitted that it was she and Norma who were responsible for the destroyed kindergarten. Let me remind you that this happened the day after the murder of Martin Brown. But the investigator already knew that they were the authors of those notes. And although one of them said that the author was responsible for the death of Martin Brown, Mary denied this, saying that it was just a joke. But Norma Bell did not object and told everything she knew about the murder of Martin Brown. A forensic examination later determined that the hairs on the girl's clothes exactly matched those found on the bodies of both victims. So which girl exactly is the killer? Is it possible they are both murderers? Unknown. The results of a psychological examination showed that Norma Bell has an intellectual developmental delay, but besides this, she is a completely balanced child. But 4 different psychiatrists gave Mary Bell the same diagnosis: psychopathic personality disorder. Ultimately, on December 17, 1968, after a 9-day trial, Norma Bell was acquitted and all charges against her were dropped. But Mary Bell was acquitted of only the charges of premeditated murder and pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of both boys. She received a sentence of imprisonment for an indefinite period. In general, the girl spent 11.5 years behind bars and was released in 1980 at the age of 23. She received the right to complete anonymity and began a new life under a new name in a new place. And after 4 years, she gave birth to a daughter who, of course, knew nothing about her mother's past, at least until 1998. Then she found out. Journalists found Mary Bell and launched a real hunt for her family, after which she changed her name again and moved once again to another part of the country. Mary Bell would be 66 years old now. I wonder if anyone, looking at her when she plays with her grandchildren, can guess what exactly she did to their peers in childhood. And also, does anyone have any idea what was done to Mary herself when she was still a child? It was a world of scary stories. Thank you for being with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Goodbye.